From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine, and your host. Join me and our lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. In January, just after the inauguration of Donald Trump, Switchyard organized a gathering of journalists from across the country to discuss how we would go about covering the new administration. We gathered together the biographers of Michelle Obama and Mitch McConnell, authors of books about the Koch brothers and the family, about Amazon and Google and Facebook, about the rise of white supremacy and the cash value of racism. We featured writers and editors for the New York Times, the LA Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Mother Jones, for StoryCorps, This American Life, and Reveal. We also had musicians, filmmakers, novelists, essayists, and poets. As we had hoped, the gathering was a source of solace, a call to action and a chance to recommit ourselves to our values and best practices, and a rekindling of our belief in the power of storytelling in all its forms. In these unprecedented and difficult times, we are once again reporting on a president who characterizes journalists as enemies of the state and jokes about killing us. And he empowers and emboldens state and local officials to indulge their most authoritarian impulses. Here in the heart of Tulsa, on the grounds of the Tulsa Race Massacre and the end of the Trail of Tears, we have state officials who have sought to block the teaching of that history while requiring schools to buy Bibles branded with the new president's name. The solemn question each of our panels addressed: what are we going to do now? In this live episode about the destructive effect of silos and misinformation, we hear from Gal Beckerman, Benjamin Peters, Peter Slevin, and Siva Vaidyanathan, with responses from Alec McGillis and Maddie Oatman. Gal Beckerman is a staff writer at The Atlantic and author of the book When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone. Benjamin Peters is an author and media scholar whose work has focused on AI and on Russian hackers and on the early uneasy history of the Soviet internet. Peter Slevin is a contributing writer for The New Yorker who has spent years covering politics and wrote a biography of Michelle Obama. Siva Vaidyanathan is a professor of media studies at the University of Virginia and the author of The Googleization of Everything and Anti-Social Media, books about Google and Facebook. And our two moderators are Alec McGillis and Maddie Oatman. Alec McGillis is a reporter at ProPublica and author of the books The Cynic, The Political Education of Mitch McConnell, and Fulfillment, America in the Shadow of Amazon. Maddie Oatman is an award-winning senior editor at Mother Jones. Thank you very much. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderators. Thank you.
Sure. Well, it's great to be here. I'm Alec McGillis, a reporter at ProPublica, also a member of the Watchdog Writers Group, which is what's brought me here. And I have done a lot of political reporting over the years before getting into my current subjects, which are a little bit off of the pure political reporting. So I'm very glad to be on this panel and ask some questions later.
Hi, I'm Maddie Oatman. I'm a senior editor at Mother Jones, and Ted mentioned some stories on immigration he's working on right now. So I'm working with him on that, which has been really awesome. I think for the purposes of this panel and maybe my question, I also just wanted to mention that I started my career as a fact checker and ran our research department for many years. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. And excited to hear from our panelists.
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Ben Peters, a dear colleague of Marianne and Ted, as well as it happens, colleague in connection with both Gal and Siva through our NYU Columbia days. I'm delighted to be here in the capacity as a media scholar who thinks occasionally about journalism and big picture public interest questions. I'm currently writing a book on Soviet AI, as well as the imagination behind Russian hackers. So I'll start with my comments then. I understand the basic instinct that's gathering us together is the question, what is to be done? Well, let's start by revising that question. That's a terrible translation of Nikolai Chernyshevsky in 1863. Что делать? 2 words. Что, what, делать, to do. It would be rendered maybe perhaps something more like, what are we going to do? It's a little bit scrappy in English. It's street smart. And I think there's something that bears a kind of stylistic resonance with what we might do in the age of eventual Trump 2.0. Namely, as I think was already beautifully modeled in the previous panel, I hope that we can call for local stories that resonate, but local stories that resonate at a global level and really draw out and target not the dread pirate Roberts of our political system. And that's reference to the doppelganger, morally vacuous identity that the pirate adopts in the famous movie Princess Bride, who occupies multiple identities. But instead that as we're targeting him, we can also learn to help our readers see the currents of the ocean and to read the wind as it blows, the pirate ships, and understand the port resources, and more broadly call out the system level violence that we might see in states or prisons or empires more broadly. Namely, I think what I need to hear myself say is that there is no progressive imperial state. And to the degree that that fact can be conveyed through local stories that still resonate with optimism, I think we're on the right track. For example, President Trump's freeze of refugees and threats of birthright citizenship brought my 12-year-old daughter to tears on Thursday. The night before, she was cradling Maverick, a 1-year-old twin who had fled from Ortega's Nicaragua to Tulsa with his family 1 month earlier. Maverick's parents are hardworking professionals. The father just secured his first job at a marble factory here in Tulsa yesterday. They named him after Top Gun and are now actively looking for the hardest jobs available here in Tulsa. And my daughter threw the questions as she heard the national level news at school. Why would asylum seekers such as Maverick and his family no longer be welcome to come to safety? What do we do with this? This is a local story. I hope that perhaps we can learn to see the ocean behind the 1-year-old named Maverick. Maybe a properly critical or democratic media should widen or refocus on a kind of anti-imperialism that would make sense of the news today. Just as I think it doesn't really make sense to think about Trump as a single bad actor, and broadly I'm calling out the failure of bad actor discourse, I think we've had a long run of this. The Cold War ideology was a terrible way of understanding the 20th century. Basically, Soviet state socialism versus American capitalism never made sense. Weak are these duels between enemies imitating enemies that are already imitating enemies. Both are imperial states, and that has resonance. So I think, well, it's totally fair that like every correct concern about whatever the national level story, the Russian nuclear saber-rattling or fratricidal invasions of Ukraine, these are profound and necessary. But every time we tell them, they have to come with a moral shadow that the U.S. has an exceptional global military presence, right? There are 800 military bases that the U.S. commands. And in the 1900s alone, there was 165 extraterritorial military operations in the last century alone. So any country that's not the U.S. has on average 0.25 military bases outside of its territory. The UK, whose kingdom the sun never once set upon, has 12. We have 800. This is a way Top Gun can be in Nicaragua, indeed. This is the story of Maverick. I also think that every time I am tempted to an analogy between Putin poisoning or imprisoning his enemies or Trump pardoning his allies, which is a difference of degree, I think, it still needs to be dwarfed by the carceral state, by the fact that the U.S. state imprisons Black citizens 4 times more often and more longer at least than its white citizens, that our asylum-seeking friends fled a country whose incarceration rate, 332 per 100,000, is actually lower than Oklahoma's, 550 out of 100,000, which would be, if it were a country, would be the 5th worst in the world. Other ways to think about these stories. How do we capture the bigger picture that's not national, right? I think we need to remind ourselves, since slavery's arrival in 1619, since George Washington first granted Native American lands in Ohio to German mercenaries who would turncoat against the British, or since my Mormon ancestors were coded non-white the moment they would leave the territory, fleeing persecution. We have to remember that structural repression by our own white ethno-nationalist state has long been the imperial baseline. How do we tell these stories without just cataclysmic despair and depression? I mean, this is why the local story matters so much. But it's also something to recognize that, like, this is part of who we are. It's the realtor's question. It's impossible for a territorially large country to not establish itself as a settler colonial empire. That's the realtor's question. Who loses which land? This is not meant to justify any of our past or present, but I think it does explain a little bit. I'll set aside some comments maybe for later just to comment on how I think bad actor discourse has failed the media through the stories of Russian hackers. We willfully voted Trump into position the second time. There's no Russian hacker that we can blame. And I think that kind of perverse vengeance of that story helps us actually reassess our own colonial impulses. That, in fact, most Russian hackers today are not Putin lackeys. They're probably fatherless young men raised in the 90s or the aughts in the aftershock of shock therapy, looking to scrape a couple bucks from targets like the Koch brothers colonial pipeline, which, once you begin to see it like that, changes the story around who global IT is and how we think about this. So in any case, I think as we look for ways of targeting the Dread Pirate Roberts in our stories, we should recognize, first of all, that this is a continuation, not a break, from the imperial corporate state and our own love-hate relationship with bad actors. Let us resist this. Let us rebuild. Let us develop new moral languages for telling true stories that matter. And as we tell local stories that matter, let us allow us to capture that kind of shadow of the imperial state in the background. There's still hope against cynicism, I think. Goodness abounds within empires. Maverick's parents adore Tulsa, and, frankly, sometimes I do too. Bad actor storytelling is in shambles. If anything, it's helped enthrone the liberal establishment's favorite bad guy. And I think we need to learn now to tell local stories that still outline our imperial legacies. In the end, I don't know exactly how to comfort my daughter's tears, except to share with her that comfort, that those tears come from a sense of care. And she cares enough for them, and perhaps she and us all will care enough to see the truth about ourselves. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Gall Beckerman. I'm a writer at The Atlantic and a bit of a late addition to this panel. So I don't have a prepared statement per se, but I think I know why I might be on here. And I'd like to talk about the book that I wrote actually 2 or 3 years ago that might provide interesting historical, theoretical questions that intersect with the bigger theme here. It's ultimately a very discrete point that I'd like to make about communication. The book I wrote was called The Quiet Before, and the impetus for it was a sense that the protest movements and the political opposition that we'd seen over the last 15 years, really globally and domestically, from anything from the Arab Spring to Black Lives Matter, was in interesting and strange ways kind of following patterns that seemed almost familiar from social media. This sense of boom and bust, this sense of grabbing attention very quickly and then fizzling out without sort of lasting consequences. And it seemed clear to me, and I think it's actually clear to most of us by this point now, that there was something about the actual biases, the form of this dominant communication that was shaping the way these movements took place. It was actually giving them, it was molding them because they were molding to fit it. And I think the good news for us is that we have all understood this about social media, both the degree to which these forms of communication are privately owned, but also the kinds of conversations that it wants us to have, which is not a great conversation for actually incubating radical ideas, new ideas, alternatives. So then the question becomes, so what, right? Is the alternative an echo chamber, which is the name of our discussion, a part of the name of our discussion here? And it's possible that maybe we've made echo chambers seem too pejorative a concept. Echo chambers were quite effective. And this is a question I want us to discuss and ask and turn it to everyone in a way, because Echo chambers have been quite effective for the right. They've been quite effective for people who want to open that Overton window of concepts and ideas that they hope that somebody like Trump will allow to manifest in the country. And on the other hand, the progressive forces in this country have tried to use social media, tried to engage, tried to compete on those attentional platforms, not as well as the other side, so to speak. So the question I have is, are there forms of, without calling them echo chambers, are there places, are there ways, forms of communication that can happen that allow for the slowness, the quietness, the sense of deliberation and conversation and back and forth that have the feature from our media studies. Affordances is a word I always like. It's a terrible academic sounding word, but the sense of what a form of communication allows you to do. So is it possible for us to find those forms of communication that actually allow for the incubation of alternatives, allow for the incubation of political opposition that might be more effective, that could be more effective than the boom and bust of a protest? Now, in my book, I looked historically. I looked pre-digitally. I started with letters in the scientific revolution, looked at petitions in small newspapers and samizdat in the Soviet Union, zines in the 90s, these analog forms of communication that allowed for a back and forth and feedback loops and a slow deliberative process of sort of building to new ideas. Now, I am not going to suggest that we pick up typewriters and return to that, although there are activists who do actually think that that is the way to go. But I think, and it's a provocative thing to maybe put out there, but maybe we do need to look at the ways that the right has communicated privately in small, enclosed chat rooms online. One of the chapters in my book is about Discord, a platform that white supremacists use leading up to Charlottesville, and how effective it was at them and beginning to develop the ideas that they wanted to bring out to the street and take over reality, which in many ways they have. So I guess that's the question that I would pose to the panel and pose to all of us, is whether we need to, first of all, have we concluded, as I have, that social media is not the place where the opposition is going to be able to take place? But also, if that's not the case, what forms of communication can actually help us to begin to think about new ways of approaching the reality that we find ourselves in?
Hello, I'm Peter Slevin, thrilled to be here. I live outside of Chicago, where I teach at Northwestern, and I write for The New Yorker, mostly about politics, where I think the most valuable thing I can do is to get out of the office and listen. I've written from probably a dozen states in the middle of the country and the South. Listening last night to the conversation, I was thinking about that Monty Python and the Holy Grail skit, "Bring out your dead." I'm not dead yet. Soon will be. I want to go for a walk. And I'd like to propose that journalists and artists and storytellers aren't dead yet, and that we may be the heart of the best resistance we've got to Trumpism and its roots in disinformation. Lord knows I don't have the answers about how to end the reign of Donald Trump or to reach the 77 million people who voted for him. But I think what we can do for sure is to think about the 78 million people who voted against him and the 90 million people who didn't vote at all. And it seems to me, this may seem sort of unsexy, but we need to be a bulwark against the unprecedented lies that we're up against and how they're resonating. We need to hold the liars, the hypocrites, the grifters to account, as hard as that is in their moment of triumph. And I guess first, it seems to me, we need to understand what we're up against, which is lying as a strategy. So 4 more years, they chant, of what? Right? Of Donald Trump, his courtiers, his cronies, his incompetence, and we're seeing it already. It's bad. It's really bad. Trump's triumph and his return to Washington with his gilded pitchfork means 4 more years of lies. 4 more years of saying that up is down and black is white, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. 4 more years of pretending that tariffs are paid by foreign governments and the 2020 election was stolen and that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. They're eating the dogs. They're eating the cats. That doctors kill babies after birth, the United States is facing an energy emergency, and of course, that he really does believe in law and order. 20 years ago, I rarely, if ever, had used the word lie about what a politician said. Maybe we should have, maybe some people did about Bill Clinton, who did indeed lie about his affair with Monica Lewinsky, but Trump is a different animal. He lies and he misrepresents facts with abandon. The Washington Post fact checker identified precisely 30,573 false or misleading claims by Trump in his first term. And he lied so much during last year's campaign that the fact checkers couldn't keep up. And he was at it again last week in the first minutes of his administration, in his inaugural address, in the first hours with that chaotic press conference, and in the first days when his PR team posted his glossy biography on the White House website. Of course, he opened with a lie, which was, quote, after a landslide election victory in 2024. We know it was no landslide. His margin of victory was 1.5 percentage points, which is the fifth narrowest margin since 1892. We know that if 115,000 of the Trump voters in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania had voted for Harris, she would be in the White House. But this is not an error of Donald Trump's and his team's. It is a strategy. Repeat the lie often enough, he's learned, and a lot of people will believe it. Remember the Russia hoax, the perfect phone call, stop the steal, and don't forget the years of lies that he told about Barack Obama and where he was born, Trump arguing that he was born in another country. And does it matter? Well, I think we can argue that it does, because in 2016, an NBC poll found that 41% of Republican voters thought Obama was born in another country, 31% weren't sure. And this was in 2016, mind you, right? After he'd been a president of the United States for 8 years. Tony Schwartz, the ghostwriter of Trump's Art of the Deal, phrased it this way in that book, with Trump's approval. Quote, I play to people's fantasies. People want to believe that something is the biggest and the greatest and the most spectacular. I call it truthful hyperbole. It's an innocent form of exaggeration, and it's a very effective form of promotion, said Donald Trump. Well, truthful hyperbole is, of course, an oxymoron, just as is alternative facts. But he's also, of course, right about lying as an effective strategy. Tens of millions of American voters do believe him, or those who don't quite believe him find him entertaining and come along for the ride. I was doing some reporting in North Carolina last fall, and I spoke with a farmer who introduced himself by saying, I am a Trump man. He said, Kamala Harris is, quote, more communist than anything else. In 4 years, we won't have Social Security. Everything all the time goes to the migrants. He believes that the Democrats led the January 6th assault on the Capitol. And when I asked what he likes about Trump, he pointed to the assassination attempt in Ohio last July. Quote, he's a fighter. He proved that when the Democrats tried to kill him. So we're probably not going to reach that farmer, no matter what we do. But if journalists and artists don't call out the lies and offer thoughtful, creative, evidence-based work on what's happening, we won't reach any of those other 170 million registered voters either. And that group, a vast majority of the country, by the way, is our hope to save the republic. So cheesy as it sounds, 4 more years. And 4 more years of relentless truth-telling, 4 more years of amplifying the myriad voices from around the country, 4 more years of sticking to the facts. It is unsexy. I think it is also essential. And I'd also add that Donald Trump and what happens in Washington is just not the whole ballgame. Not nearly. And what's happening outside the Beltway, as I don't need to tell this dedicated crowd in Omaha, is essential and in many places hopeful. I think many of the challenges, the solutions, and yes, the resistance will be local, and where we can support and if necessary resurrect local news and share the fruits of local reporting, I think we have a fighting chance. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Siva Vaidyanathan, and I am a spectacular failure. For more than 25 years, I have been writing, speaking, and teaching about the looming ascension of the tech oligarchy. And as of last Monday, as they sat front and center at the inauguration, it was pretty clear that my work has made zero difference in the world. This is probably a feeling that you have had to some degree in your careers as well. It's not an uncommon feeling in moments like this. My work has been distributed under such titles as Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy, and The Googleization of Everything and Why We Should Worry. I've written similarly for Wired and The Nation and The New Republic, currently write for The Guardian and some other publications fairly frequently, to almost no effect. All right, so let me talk about failure and, in fact, embrace it, accept it. You can't fact-check your way out of fascism. Yesterday, Ted described an encounter, much like we have all had. He was talking to someone who happened to believe something that was batshit crazy. And we've all talked to people who believe things that are batshit crazy. And we've all talked to people who refuse to believe things that are clear and obvious and documented. And Ted asked the question we have all asked ourselves and asked everyone we've encountered. How do you argue against this? Well, the fact is, you can't. And you might not even try. Now, let me pause and say, I'm going to go beyond that, but I will return to that thought, that you can't argue against it. Because arguing is a particular device, a particular cultural form that we're all good with in this room, but it doesn't really extend much beyond our community. And again, let me return to that later. Now, in that description and in Ted's ruminations about that moment, he used the phrase information bubbles. And we've thought about echo chambers, as Gall has invoked as well. I want to pop that bubble. That phrase, information bubbles, reveals its own failure. It describes its own bubble, right? To even invoke that is to invoke a bubble in itself. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me and get beyond the truth-false axis. I think that's not always a healthy, in fact, often an unhealthy way to try to diagnose our condition, our ecosystem, our world, and definitely our country. And that is our habit. Our habit is, as Peter just related, to say, he's lying. I want to assert that it's not that important that he lies. It's important why he lies. It's important why anyone lies. But more importantly, it's important to understand why people believe it. That is where we should be digging. To understand, to address our situation, our ecosystem, we must invoke and understand the cultural and the emotional beyond the truth-false axis. We must step back from thinking it's a matter of information or argumentation, because it's really about affiliation and affirmation and identity. For most people, it's about affiliation, affirmation, and identity. And I say most people, that actually includes us. Now, I come to these assertions through my own study of Facebook and other social media, through the connections and ecological flows of expression and, yes, information among different forces in our media ecosystem. Specifically, I've dug into, for many years, the persistence of flat earth communities and moon landing denial communities in Facebook groups. That's just to point out one example of where this stuff thrives. But I'm also relying on a brilliant book that I hope all of you read. It's called The Propagandist Playbook. It's by a sociologist named Francesca Tripodi. She's at the University of North Carolina. And The Propagandist Playbook is based on years of deep ethnography among highly educated, fairly elite Bible study groups in North Carolina, right? So these are people who understand what we would think of as media literacy, who understand how words work, how sentences work, how paragraphs work, how arguments work. And these are people who are deeply committed to popping the very bubbles that we in our community believe in, the bubbles that are forged through the practices of journalism, scholarship, and science. These are the people who are the most fervent activists for homeschooling, for curricular deform, for political movements that many of us would consider quite abhorrent in North Carolina. And these are people who are really good close readers, not just of scripture, but of everything. These are not ignorant people. These are not uneducated people. They are powerful thinkers, and they know what they're doing, and they do it well. Now, to understand our situation, we must acknowledge the presence of what Richard Rorty, building upon William James, has called discursive communities, because that's actually what we're dealing with here. Discursive communities make truth for themselves. They generate truth. They produce truth. They do it through consensus. And it's a process, but ultimately it's a feeling. These communities feel their way to truth, and their members feel the truth when they adopt it. A fact is a feeling. And that's not something we're used to acknowledging. I really want you to acknowledge that. A fact is a feeling. Now, William James wrote that a belief is that upon which one is willing to act. So that's the test of what people actually believe, that they're willing to act upon it. It's not actually what they say. It's how they behave in the world. Now, I often ask my students when discussing these very issues, why do you believe that the climate is warming? Why do you believe the polar ice caps are melting? You've never been there. You've never taken a core of ice. You've never run the numbers through a database and used predictive modeling. Why do you believe that the climate is warming? And by the way, I've never had a student tell me that the climate is not warming or that humans are not behind it. Not sure why I've not encountered those students, but I guess I've been lucky. But this only works when you're talking to students who do believe it. And they all say the same things we would all say. Some of you have actually probably been to the polls. I haven't. Most of us probably haven't. They say, well, I trust the science. I trust the scientists. I trust their methods. I trust their community. I trust their consensus. Because after all, that is how we forge truth. That's how those groups of Bible study experts come to truth, by forging consensus. That is how scientists come to truth, by forging consensus. The process we all subscribe to, being in this discursive community, involves such elements as reporting, editing, publishing, feedback and criticism, experimentation, observation, documentation, peer review, and replication, right? These are the instruments we use, and we understand that what we accept as the truth is contingent because over the centuries, we have come to rely on these processes to document and describe and express what we consider the truth. So what do we do with that? We are actually in our own discursive community and in so many ways sealed off from those for whom truth is not generated by those processes like observation, documentation, peer review, etc., but instead is revealed. The idea that truth comes from revelation is, of course, much older and much deeper and much better established than the truth comes from the deliberation that we all depend on. So revelation is older, deeper, more solid, more steady than deliberation. But we are in the deliberative discursive community. We are the group for whom sincere argumentation matters. We have to understand that there is a big limit to that. So what do we do, right, as members of this discursive community? What's the hope for us? What's our job when we stare into the abyss and we recognize our own failure to convince, to enlighten, to communicate, or to educate? Well, look, on the one hand, our truth still matters. Our version of truth deeply matters, right? Lives are at stake. The quality of our air and water is at stake. The fingers of people who work in factories are at stake. So our truth still matters. Perhaps it has less of an effect than it did recently, but more than it did a century ago or 2 centuries ago. Our discursive community is very recent. It's also very fragile. So again, let's though take comfort in the fact that our truth still matters. It still matters to billions of people. It still matters to people who are not part of our discursive community because they breathe the same air and they drink the same water and they also lose fingers in factories. Documents matter. The documents we produce matter. So we should not surrender to this hopelessness, to this reality. In fact, what we do might matter more in 10, 20, 50, or 100 years than it matters today. That's what I keep telling myself, or at least I've tried to tell myself that since Monday. On the other hand, we do owe it to ourselves to accept the truth that the assertions like, this is evidence, or this is science, or this is documented, will not be effective at scale anytime soon. Not in this country and probably not in most of the world. So what is the duty or the role or the hope for the scientist, the scholar, or the journalist at this moment, at a moment like this? We're going to have to lower our expectations. We're also going to have to keep a faith in the future, though. We shouldn't fool ourselves into believing that we're going to have any sort of immediate or short-term influence. This is not about the next election, even though lives are at stake in the next election. Lives are at stake in the next policy decision made in Washington, D.C. We must document it, as Peter was preaching, like we must put it forth. We must make sure it's out there. So to do this job, to not reflect on our failure and our limitations, we have to take as our model people who figured this out long ago and have been working in this kind of environment for a long time. The brave journalists of Mexico, the brave journalists of India, the brave journalists of the Philippines, of Turkey, and of Russia. And they're still doing their work, even though they don't have any realistic hope in having their work actually change things in front of them. But we should also take as historical models journalists like Adam Michnik, scientists like Andrei Sakharov, poets and playwrights like Václav Havel, leaders like Nelson Mandela, because we are all dissidents now in our own country. Soon, we might not be allowed to publish our truth in magazines or between covers of a book, but we will always have samizdat. Thank you.
Hmm.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to ask 2 quick questions and then turn it to the audience. So there's a lot here. I'm building on what you were just talking about, but all of you, in some ways, I've been thinking about the journalist Peter Pomerantsev, who covers propaganda a lot. And he has said that when it comes to counteracting contemporary propaganda, fact-checking doesn't stand a chance. Gutsy fact-checkers who sometimes at great personal risk strive to establish the truth are ignored by millions of people who don't want to hear the truth. He's also talked about how counteracting propaganda, it's not really a matter of persuasion. I'm curious kind of where that leaves us as journalists and whether in the coming era, we need to think about any shifts in strategy or if the task is doubling down on what we have always done or believed in. And another way of asking that is, do we need to think about appealing to things other than people's minds and reasoning?
That's kind of what Gall's work is on, right?
Yeah, and
Totally.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the books that I have to say I read in the last 2 weeks that's given me some solace is Václav Havel's Power of the Powerless. And the most powerful thing about that book is his notion that you do what you do because you have a set of values, not because of its effectiveness. You do what you do because you understand that you are staying true to a certain idea of truth. And I think that I would say double down. And the doubling down might get harder. It might indeed have the repercussions that dissidents have faced in other countries. But I see that is sort of a more important way to focus energy than trying to convince the other side for all the reasons.
Yes, and I think we've all at various points advocated for or experimented with trying to fit these habits of mind and habits of expression in our current media ecosystem, and it just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit financially. It doesn't fit rhetorically. It doesn't fit. It doesn't play. It doesn't travel like some other forms of expression. It's forms of expression that are all about striking the emotions, all about generating some sort of rush, because that's the world we live in more than ever before. That's what YouTube's about. That's what Instagram's about. That's what TikTok's about, right? And that is increasingly what Fox News and CNN and MSNBC are about as well. So the sort of deep work that we all perform and appreciate and honor has no easy way of traveling. It's harder than ever to make it matter. So yes, double down, but there must be tactics rather than strategies that allow us to puncture the current media ecosystem. And one of the ways we're going to have to do that is not to pander to it, but to build up and sustain and defend the institutions that allow for deep deliberation, that foster deep deliberation. That's hard work, right? That's not something that gets to be done by the next midterm elections. That's hard work of defending museums and chautauquas and universities and other forums that actually foster and allow deep consideration to spread. And that is ultimately the duty that we all have, is to defend and protect these institutions, expand them where they can when they're under the greatest threat. It is no accident that in the first 72 hours of this administration, they gutted science. I mean, they basically gutted health science in this country. in this country and beyond. They've stopped AIDS prevention programs around the world. This is not unintentional. This is part of their immediate goal. And that's where our defenses have to be. Again, we're all dissidents and we're all on the defense, but we have to protect these very few institutions we have left that facilitate deep deliberation. But accept, again, that it's not going to have the play that it used to.
I have a few thoughts, and I do think it's about connecting emotionally, which we're sort of trying to do anyway. I mean, I think that was the topic of the first panel today, finding the characters, finding the moments, finding the details that allow an audience to pay attention. But I also wonder if we're not always thinking of the right audience, because persuasion, right, fact-checking doesn't work. We've seen that. But maybe our audience, our main audience, isn't the true believers. We're not going to persuade them, but there is an awfully large audience around the country of people who are not the true believers, who maybe don't care, or in fact are opposed. And why will the true believers change? If they're in politics, they're going to change because people are going to vote them out. Mm-hmm. And if you can reach people with your stories, that can change things. And then the second thing is, quite apart from Trump as fascist or Trump as authoritarian, whatever term you want to use, there are a bazillion things going on locally and at the state level where you can tell stories, where you can make a difference, where you're probably not facing fascism necessarily, where all kinds of good stuff can happen if you can reach your audiences.
Yeah, I love this. Yes, and I think, so what if by doubling down on one's values, one might also have a sufficiently rigorous approach to new strategies that might produce stories, right? I think local stories, moments, characters remains a trope here, that because you take it so seriously also necessitates that you get outside of a single discursive community to which you redouble your values still. For example, like a proper story isn't just a single piece, but to imagine oneself as part of a larger ecosystem. You know, there's the meme version, Are We the Baddies, right? There's the 15-second TikTok video that builds upon it. Upon that might be like a BuzzFeed article that links to still your piece, that leads with a story, right? That has the person at the center of it, that connects to a deeper dive piece, that links itself to some scholarly article, that links to a book review or bibliography, that links to, I'm not done, a full-on literature that links to the philosophical tradition, that links to the historical critical revision and development of proper textual interpretation within monotheisms. All of a sudden, like, you string all of it together and you're no longer in a single discursive community. You're on TikTok and you're in Sunday school and you're in lots of places where you're experiencing the connective emotions that pull us together while singly redoubling our commitment to truth-telling and stories that matter. I think these are not contradictory recommendations.
So this is a little tricky, not tricky, but a little contrarian. Underlying a lot of our talk here and also last night is the assumption that most of the silos are on the other side and most of the misinformation or bad information is on the other side. I've talked to many voters over the years, just like the one that Peter mentioned, you know, just 2016 crazy ideas about Benghazi and whatnot that she had gotten off of Facebook. And so I've seen a lot of that. But let's face it, in the last few years, we saw a lot of what turned out to be overheated talk about Russian interference that turned out to be not totally based in reality. We saw an immediate move to quash talk about a possible lab leak in China, COVID lab leak, describing that as xenophobic and simply not worthy of discussion, which in hindsight turned out to be also misguided, to say the least. Around the time of school closures, we saw a lot of people in Blue America barely even aware that schools had actually opened in much of the rest of the country without the world ending. In immigration, we only recently, I think, it has really registered in a lot of Blue America just how massive the immigration numbers were of the last few years. Record-breaking, record-tying, and just the scale of that, whatever one thinks of it, just the sheer scale of it, I think hadn't really percolated through a lot of our community. And then most consequentially, the emperor with no clothes dynamic that happened around Biden the last couple of years, where the suggestion that he might be unfit was deemed to be misinformation from the other side, the product of cobbled together videos. And I think that was one of the most consequential, that, as I see it, was the election. Joe Biden's insisting on running again was the election, and it's why we're here. with this reality we have now. So I guess I'm wondering, what do we do about our own silos? I mean, I guess, Gal, as you were saying, we need our own echo chambers, and I understand what you mean by that. But I think that's a different echo chamber that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on this? Our own silos, what do we do about them? Because I think they have become a real problem.
I think part of the problem is that if there is this epistemic divide in the country, the more and more we become aware of it, the more also we double down on our own side of the epistemology, on what we think we know. And again, I'm inside that discourse, right?
Yeah.
So, and we all are. We all have to think of ourselves as sociologists or anthropologists here, sort of questioning our own assumptions and our own biases. But I like to think that there are corrections that take place. I know they do. I mean, if we take our New York Times example from last night, like the New York Times will go back and revisit the lab leak theory. The New York Times will say, hey, wait a second, who was hiding? There was an article of the day, who was actually hiding Biden's infirmities from the public? That process of constantly questioning and not taking for granted, I think, is still part of that deliberative side, that deliberative discourse that exists. But the political implications of it in the short term, I agree with you that it's sort of when the pendulum swings too far this way, it swings, the other way. So I think the assumption that you're making, I think, is a true one, and I agree with it. But I think the wrinkle for me is that I see moments of return and feedback and, hey, wait a second, maybe we weren't exactly right about that.
I think it's really important that we suspend the red-blue distinction when trying to examine what's really wrong here. And what you're pointing out is stuff that is wrong. The very fact that you're pointing out stuff that is wrong, and we are able to deploy the instruments of criticism and feedback and revision, et cetera, which are core elements of our discursive community, means we are at the liberty and the privilege of challenging our previous assumptions, right? All our truths are contingent, whether we want to believe it or not. At least social truths are contingent. And that is what we're seeing. And that's healthy. That's not a problem. The fact that you have that list is a beautiful thing. If we were a discursive community that was more Gnostic, more based on revelation, or one from which truth doesn't challenge power, truth emerges from power, we would not be in that situation. The idea of questioning a core tenet would be threatening to our identity and maybe even our safety, right? So that is the difference. And it's a real difference. And when we think about these discursive communities, let's understand it's also really helpful to get beyond politics, not just red-blue, but like politics in general. Politics is where we usually see it working out, what we're most concerned with most of the time. But it has to do with sports teams and hobbies. It has to do with literature and religion. It has to do with whether you believe the earth is flat or round. And that's not necessarily going to affect how you vote. Whether you believe people actually walked on the moon, which, by the way, is super fascinating if you want to dig into this. And it's like old stuff, like it's as old as 1969, whether people walked on the moon. And it's growing, and there are leading major NBA players who believe we've not walked on the moon, who went to Duke. I'm from UVA, so of course I'll make fun of Duke any chance I get, right? So this is where we can see these dynamics work out in fascinating ways. And if you look at those apolitical situations of weird beliefs that sustain themselves, and you ask yourself, why do they sustain themselves? And what's the payoff? What does anybody gain in their lives from believing we didn't walk on the moon, right? That's fascinating. And that reveals a lot more that then you can apply to questions of whether you believe Antifa was behind January 6th.
I think Alec's questions are great. And I wonder if it's almost as simple as thinking about the journalism we do and the journalists who do it and what our starting points are. Think about 2016. Think of the journalists who said, well, Trump's not going to get elected. And why did they not think he was going to get elected? Because they didn't get out of the office and actually talk to people and know what was going on. And it certainly strikes me that we should be challenging our assumptions all the time. We should start with questions and not answers. And we should get out and find things out. There was an enormous amount of armchair punditry after November. And it struck me that an awful lot of those stories were people who hadn't gone out and talked to anybody new. They had just said, oh, well, this proves what I've been saying all along. I spent a lot of time in Wisconsin in 2024. So I sort of waited for the dust to settle. And then in December, went up and talked to lots of people who had been knocking on doors for months. And lo and behold, these were Democrats. I focused on Democrats because that was where the self-examination was coming from. And what I found was a state where, yes, Harris lost. She lost by only 30,000 votes. Tammy Baldwin won. Democrats flipped 14 seats in the Assembly and the state Senate. And then, of course, we know in North Carolina, Harris lost, but the Democrats swept every statewide seat. And they said, let's not just throw out the entire playbook. Let's not throw out the values that make us Democrats. These are the kinds of things people were saying. I think that's what we ought to do. Not so much our voices, but the voices we can go out and learn from. And maybe if we start with questions and not answers, we won't get led astray by our own preconceptions.
I think we might have time
Yes.
for a question or two from the audience.
Thanks so much. This is actually inspired by one of your comments from Peter Plummer-Stav. He was saying we never look at the demand side. What's driving the demand of people that go to sites that they know might be conspiracy theories or off-center news? And I'm curious what you guys think is driving that demand. And then also if social cohesion plays a part in that demand.
Oh, yeah. I mean, homophily is the sociological term for that, right? The notion of being part of a group of people who are reminding you that you have figured something out, that you might be smarter than everybody else, that you might be better or more moral than somebody else, or that the powers that be who are making your life difficult actually are pulling something over your eyes. I mean, those are pretty clear motivations, and they all have been the motivations for everything from joining cults to believing QAnon, which I guess is a cult now too, to believing that the earth is flat. Or for that matter, believing that Trump will somehow lower the price of groceries. That suspension of disbelief, that subscription, is motivated in large part by this quest for affirmation. And the crueler the world gets, the colder the country gets, the more people will strive for that affirmation. It's a deep, basic human need to be reminded that you're okay, that you're smart, and that, yeah, the world really is crushing you, and here's how. So any simple explanation, or even weird, complex explanation that is at least totalizing, is going to appeal to somebody.
But it's also true that if what people are looking for is a sense of meaning that comes through easy answers, then we've just shown here on this stage how if this is a battle of discourses, one side of it is like, well, I don't know, maybe it was like this, maybe it wasn't. We should look at it again. We should ask more questions. Maybe we should revise what we thought already. And the other side is they didn't walk on the moon. So if you're looking for easy answers, and again, we're approaching this with our own biases again, but it seems like that's part of why it's hard to stem that demand with something that comes from the other way.
Well, I don't think we can alleviate that phenomenon. I think that phenomenon is core to being a social human. I do think we can alleviate or mitigate misery and hopelessness, which is a major draw, a major pull factor in the search for that kind of cheap affirmation. If we can actually develop a sense of deep meaning in our communal and social and cultural lives, something that was part of the public imagination as late as 40 years ago. If we can have at some point leaders say we should be investing in public institutions and arts and the flourishing of society, and do so in an unembarrassing way and in a convincing way and in a way that actually leverages the wealth and power that we all live around, then there's a chance of lowering the demand for such cheap, easy, and destructive senses of affirmation, because we're able to get affirmation from our actual real lives. That is a long way off, and we're going way backwards from that. I blame Reagan, but whatever.
Benjamin.
I just have a quick footnote. I just want to add, I love your question. I also don't think there's a common discourse that we can belong to, but one thing that we can do is identify our own broken world thinking. You know, these conspiracy theories are broken world explanations. Like Marxism and psychoanalysis in their early conceptions are basically theories common to the discursive textual traditions that explain why the world's broken, right? They give sometimes too easy answers, and there's centuries of people trying to make sense of that. But another way of reframing that is, no matter how we use words, I think what we share is an interest, at least not all of us. I mean, there are corrupt people who want ill in the world, but most of us want a less broken world. So there are ways of setting up words to do work to compel people to make practical decisions that I think can prompt a kind of, they don't have to agree, and nobody may ever know that they agree, but we'll all want little Timmy to be less sick. So we can frame questions like, let's look at the number of little Timmies that have been sick over pre-vaccination and post-vaccination. Which bet would we like to make? And if we can ask practical decisions like, which one's more likely that, this may not be quite right, it's a fool's hope, I know, but is it more likely that World A, 50,000 NASA scientists spent 50 years doing everything to assemble a rocket to send it to the moon, 15 years, pointing in the right direction, and then not send it and hold it for a conspiracy, keep it secret for the next 30 years? Or did they actually just push ignition? You can compel people with words to make practical decisions sometimes, but that can also be cheap and worrisome. So
not at scale.
Yeah, not at scale. But I just think in person and through our stories. I'll pause.
I'm stepping in again. Here I am. Thank you all. This was fantastic. Thank you all for being here and for the questions and conversation, which can continue now as we break for lunch. Those of you who have your lanyards, who are part of the folks who we have brought in to make things easy, the lunch is available for us on the second floor. Those of you who have been good enough to join us from the public, I hope that you will patronize the businesses who are nearby, the restaurants that are across the street, that are up and down, and that you'll come back to join us. We will be reconvening at 1:45. We will be back here in this room and on this stage. I hope you'll be back to join us. And thanks so much. Thanks for listening to Switchyard. I'm your host, Ted Genoways. If you liked this episode and you want to support our podcast, please share it with your friends, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Switchyard is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. We made this episode with executive producer Marianne Andre and Charles Lipper, Cass Ali, and Aaron Wald at Volubility Podcasting. Special thanks to the Church Studio.